Welcome to the LA Steel Show. I'm Leila. Our guest today is Gale Courey Toensing. Gale is just back from a trip to Palestine and to the West Bank, and she's consented to share with us some of the events that happened while she was there and some of her impressions of the Palestinian people and their issues. Welcome to the show, Gale.
Thanks, Leila. Nice to be here.
Oh, thank you. I thought it would be helpful if we took a look at the map in back of us and you could explain to us a little bit about the territory that is Palestine and where you were on this trip.
Well,
let's take a look here.
First of all, when I speak of Palestine, Palestine to me will always be historic Palestine, which is the entire area that includes the State of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. I didn't travel very much in the Israel section. I was in the West Bank.
Now, if we take a look at this bigger map, Gale, this part that's outlined in black, that is all the West Bank?
Yes.
And this area in blue is considered Israel?
Yes.
Now, the West Bank, when we refer to the West Bank, we're actually talking about the West Bank of the River Jordan,
yes,
which flows here.
Yes.
Okay. And you spent most of your time in Nablus,
yes,
which is right here.
Yes.
Okay. Now, while you were in Nablus, there was really an event that happened called the Siege of Nablus, and that was very scary. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I know our folks that are watching this show, they're not familiar with these events because it wasn't covered by the American press.
No, it wasn't. And it was barely covered, actually, by the Arab press, and that's because Nablus is a city in northern Palestine that has been consistently occupied by the Israeli occupation forces.
This is the area where you spent most of your time, Nablus, and at the beginning of the show there was a montage of pictures, and most of those showed the folks at home the siege of Nablus,
yes,
what happened before, during, and after to this city. So tell our folks that are watching a little bit about what happened.
Well, I arrived in Nablus on Monday, and the night before, the previous night, Sunday night, a bunch of Israeli occupation soldiers had entered the old city on a foot patrol, which they really knew better than to do that. They engaged in a battle with some of the resistance fighters there, and one of the Israeli occupation soldiers was killed. The next night, Monday night, or rather Tuesday night, soldiers came into the old city again, this time in armored vehicles, and they fired off their guns for about an hour and a half. And they shot out all of the street lights. No one was injured that night, Tuesday night. The next night, Wednesday night, they came in force, a whole invasion force with armored personnel carriers and jeeps and tanks. Came into the old city, came into Nablus at 3:30 in the morning, and took up positions around a building called the Muqata'a, which was a massive administrative building that was built by the British during the British Mandate in the 1920s. And they began to arrest people. The Muqata'a was surrounded by, was at the center of a complex of public buildings that included the Ministry of the Interior, the Red Crescent Emergency Medical Services Building, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Health, and a prison and Palestinian security guard police station and prison.
Let me just interrupt you for a moment. Was this in response to resistance, to some kind of chaos, or why did they come in and take this building?
Well, no one really knows. I mean, they come in all the time. The occupation claims to withdraw from Palestinian cities, but they have military installations all over the country. And in the case of Nablus, they have a military installation near the checkpoint into the city. Checkpoint is called Huwara. So it's 5 minutes away. So they're constantly coming into the city and either demolishing houses or killing people in the refugee camps, or the last time I was there, they blew up a transformer and put half the city out of electricity. There's no I mean, there's no reason.
There was no
for it.
specific event.
Well, I assume they came in to avenge the death of the soldier that that died on Sunday night when they came into the city and got into a clash. But who knows? I mean, they're constantly they're the occupation.
So this isn't an isolated event.
No,
it was an event that happened while you were there.
Right.
But it's not an unusual occurrence.
No, because this is the nature of a military occupation. There are soldiers there, and they kill people, and they blow up things, and they destroy buildings. But anyway, that's they did come in force on Wednesday night and proceeded to demolish this whole complex of buildings. And they arrested over 100 Palestinian security guards and policemen, which attracted a huge crowd of Palestinian Nablus residents who wanted to know what had happened to their brothers and husbands and sons and fathers.
And those, in the pictures that you took, those were the women who were gesturing.
The women and the kids, this huge crowd gathered by 7 o'clock in the morning. And of course, the young men got into a clash with the soldiers. The teenagers throw stones at the jeeps, and then the jeeps chase them and shoot off either sound bombs or rubber bullets, which are deadly, actually. The rubber bullets are steel bullets covered in rubber, but it sounds as if they're innocuous when you say rubber bullets, but they're just as deadly as live ammunition.
I didn't know
and
that.
They usually go through a progression of sound bombs, rubber bullets, and then live ammunition. So over the 3 days of the siege, 6 people were killed, and 85 people were injured, including several emergency medical personnel people. And it was constant. It was 24 hours a day for 3 days. And when they left, when the soldiers left, this whole complex of public buildings was demolished, was just rubble.
Now, my understanding in those public buildings were records, birth record, death records, passports, and a history.
Yes, a history, 100-year history of the residents of the Nablus district were destroyed in the destruction of the Ministry of the Interior. And the officials who run the ministry actually said that this is a war crime. That it's a war crime to demolish public buildings, to demolish records. These are records of refugees who are still not able to return to their homes in Palestine. They're records of Palestinian citizens who live in other parts of the world. You know, people who were ethnically cleansed in 1948 and their descendants, who are displaced people, and they have no country, really. They have no
a homeland.
Homeland. I mean, Palestine is their homeland. This is where they were born, but the Israelis don't allow them to come back to their home, to their homeland and their homes.
Would you explain that once people leave, they're not allowed to come back?
Well, in 1948, when the State of Israel was unilaterally declared to exist by Ben-Gurion, before he declared the State of Israel, there was a lot of fighting going on. The Zionist settlers were very well prepared for this moment, for the moment to create the State of Israel. They had been building up what has been called the Iron Wall. This was a term that was coined by an early Zionist by the name of Vladimir Jabotinsky in a paper that he wrote in 1923. He was a Russian and a Zionist, and he's called the father of militant Zionism. And basically he said, we're going to take this land. The indigenous population of this land, the Palestinians, are not going to be happy about giving it to us because no people willingly give up their homeland. So the only way we can do it is by building this iron wall of military strength that the local indigenous population can never really come up against. And that's what they've done. Since the 1920s, the Zionists have built up this amazing body of military power, which is supported by America, by your tax dollars and my tax dollars, to the tune of $15 million a day.
So everywhere you go in the West Bank, there are soldiers in military installations?
Yes. And if they're not immediately visible, for example, in Bethlehem, you don't necessarily see Israeli soldiers in the street. And you get, I often said to my friends there, oh, on a busy Saturday in Bethlehem when everybody's shopping or something, oh, it looks like any normal place. People
Right.
are out with their children, they're buying groceries, they're going shopping. But if you want to get out of Bethlehem,
Now, where
for
is
example-
Bethlehem on the map here? Let's take a look at that. Here's the pointer.
let's see if I can find it. Jerusalem, Bethlehem is right here. It's just, okay, here's Jerusalem, and here's Bethlehem. And normally, it would take 10 minutes to travel from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. And it can take 10 minutes. There's what they call the tunnel road from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, but only Israelis are allowed to use it.
And why is that, Gale?
Well, it's because the illegal military occupation controls the population of Palestine. It controls the movement of Palestinians on the Jewish-only roads.
Oh, okay.
This military occupation has developed into a complete apartheid system. You have the wall that is surrounding every major Palestinian population center. Bethlehem is surrounded by a wall that's 25 to 30 feet tall, concrete wall with observation towers and sometimes in some parts of it behind the wall or in front of the wall is an electrified fence. There are layers of so-called security that contains and controls the movement of Palestinians, so that if you're living in occupied Palestine, the occupation is a factor of your life every single minute of the day. You wake up in the morning and you don't know if you can get to work, or if your kids can get to school, or if you can make that doctor's appointment in the next town, because
You may not be able to get there.
you may not be able to get out. You may be turned away at the checkpoint. There may be a curfew. Americans have no idea what it means to live under a military occupation.
No, we don't. We've been very fortunate as a
Yeah.
people. Now, these roads that are Israeli-only roads, were they built by the Israelis?
Yes.
They just came in and decided they were going to put a road,
Well, what has happened is the Israelis have built, I think...
like a web of roads?
Yeah, there are a web of roads that connect I think there's more than 200 illegal settlements. So they connect the settlements...
When you say illegal settlements, can you explain that a little bit for
Well,
our
I can
viewers?
explain it really simply by saying that in 2004, the International Court of Justice ruled that a very important ruling that not only is the apartheid wall, this wall that they've built around all of the population centers, and by the way, the wall has confiscated tens and tens of thousands of acres of Palestinian land. Not only is that wall illegal, but the International Court of Justice also ruled that the settlements are illegal. They're illegal according to international law.
Now, those settlements are Israeli settlements on Palestinian
on
land,
stolen Palestinian land
in the West Bank. Okay.
Which is not to say that land in Israel is not stolen, because it is as well. There's very little land in historic Palestine that was legitimately acquired by the settlers, the colonists coming in. Very little. It's comparable to America, actually, where Americans, I think 1/3 of America is legitimately owned by non-Native Americans. The rest, through legal purchase or treaty, and the rest of it has been illegally confiscated. Israel calls it expropriation, but that's just a fancy word for stealing.
So when that happened, the people were just pushed to the West Bank.
In 1948?
In 1948,
When
into Gaza?
Well, no, more than that, more than the West Bank and Gaza. Those people are sort of internally displaced. They're internal refugees. But more than 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from Palestine, from historic Palestine. Some of them and their descendants are in Gaza and the West Bank, but huge numbers. I think it's close to 6.5 million are now outside of historic Palestine. There are refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, in Jordan, and then there are people who are just displaced, you know, who are living in other countries.
Now, the people who live, say, in a refugee camp in Egypt or Syria, would they be able to return to Palestine?
No, these are the people that cannot return. This is what the right of return, you know, coalition works on, and all the people who support it, is to, and that right is embedded in international law. The right to return is embedded in international law, and it's an individual right, and it's an inalienable right. Nobody can, you know, no government or government official or prime minister or president of Palestine can give that right away, or negotiate it away, or trade it for peace with Israel, or it's an individual and a collective right. And if somebody says, no, I want to go back to my village, which of course is probably no longer there, they still have the right to do that.
Now, when I was looking at some of your photographs, which were wonderful, there was one that really touched me, and that was of the gentleman. You have him, I think he's on a balcony in his house, and he's looking out toward his olive groves, and there's a road.
Right.
And you told me that he can't even walk across that road to get to his property.
Right, Mr. Uthman, I believe his name is. He lives in the Tulkarm, Kalkilia area. We went and visited him, and his family has been living there and growing olives for 4 or 5 generations. The Israelis came in and they built a road that's maybe 100 yards from his house that cuts him off from his 400, I'm not sure if it's 400 dunams or 400 acres of land. And he's, of course, not allowed to travel on that road. That's just for Israelis. He said the Israelis allow him to go to his land, but he has to travel 15 kilometers to get through a gate, to cross the road, to get to his land. And the gate is sometimes open, but sometimes not open. And only he and his wife, or he and a donkey, are allowed to go on his land. Now,
so he couldn't employ any workers to pick the olives.
Right. And before this wall was built, this road was built, his family produced, I think he said, 12 tons of olive oil, which he sold and used. And last year they had to buy olive oil for the first time in 4 or 5 generations.
That's really a sad story.
It's
Gale.
a horrible story.
It is. It's very sad.
And the thing is, he stands on his balcony
and he looks at
his land and he can't get to it, and it's just there at the end of his yard, basically.
What would happen to him if he crossed that road?
He'd be shot. He'd be shot. There are Israeli soldiers in jeeps that patrol the road back and forth. And this has happened not only to him, but to his whole extended family. His whole family owns property along the Palestinian road where his house is, all, you know, for miles up the road. And of course, all of their land has been taken from them. They're cut off from it by this Israeli road that goes through, that's been built
through the center of their property.
Through the center of their property.
I know that there's an organization that you support that's talking about boycotting in order to bring attention to these issues. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about that organization?
Well, it's not so much an organization as it is a global movement. And what happened is last July 2005, a year after the International Court of Justice decision, a group of Palestinians issued a call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions that was signed by, more than 170 Palestinian organizations. And as I said, it's a global campaign to divest and divest funds from Israel. That would be more like universities or companies or unions.
Very similar to the pressure that was put on South Africa.
Exactly.
And was very successful.
Exactly. It's a non-violent means of resistance that will really hurt where it matters, you know, in the pocketbook, in the Israeli pocketbook, which is important. And it's also important that people realize that we're paying $15 million a day from American taxpayer funds to support Israel's existence and to support its occupation, its illegal occupation, its illegal settlements, its violations of human rights of the Palestinians, civil rights, national rights. You know, people have a right to self-determination. And for the last 60 years almost, the Israelis have been preventing Palestinians from achieving those rights. And, you know, the question is why? Why does America support this rogue regime, this rogue country that continuously violates international law and hurts people?
And with that, I want to thank you very much for being a guest on our show.
Thank you.
And I hope you come back and talk with us again.
Thanks.
Good evening. I'm L.A. Still. We have, for the second part of this series on the Palestinian and Israeli issue, we have with us tonight Mazin Qumsiyeh. Mazin is a remarkable fellow. He's not only is he a geneticist and a former professor at Yale and Duke, or rather Yale and Duke, correct? And he is also he is the spokesman for the Palestinian American Congress, and also involved with the U.S. campaign to end the occupation. And he is author of this book, the Sharing the Land of Canaan, and I highly recommend you read it to get learn quite a bit about what's going on. We now turn to Mazin. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Leo.
We really do appreciate you being here. You asked me to hit you hard tonight with a lot of hard questions, and I have a lot of hard questions. And the questions, though, aren't so much against the Palestinian issue as it is against the Israeli and the Zionist concepts here that have invaded your country. And it is troublesome, because I've only been fully aware of this problem for maybe a year. Okay, that it's really been coming clear to me who and what are the players here. Can you explain to our audience what exactly this occupation, how it began in such a violation, all right? Just the imposition of the Zionists in 1948 onto innocent people, and causing this ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to have any real rhyme or reason other than just an aggressive occupation. Can you explain to the people how this happened?
I was born in a small village called Beit Sahur. It's the shepherd's field where the shepherd saw the star went up to Bethlehem. It's primarily a Christian village. My family is Palestinian Christian. And before the British came into Palestine, 1918 to 1920, Palestine consisted of about 85% Muslim population, about 10% Jewish, 10% Christian, and about 5% Jewish. And my grandfather's best friend in school actually was Jewish. So there's Christians, Muslims, and Jews living in harmony in this land that was called Palestine for over 3,000 years. Then there was a new movement called Zionism, which came into the picture around the end of the 19th century, which called for transforming this country into a Jewish state, a Jewish country. And of course, to do that, you have to do a simple thing, which is remove the Christian and Muslims from this land. And this occurred not in one step. Of course, it occurred in a number of steps and continues to occur today, with continued home demolitions and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Palestine. In 1947 to 1949, for example, over 530 Palestinian villages, towns, and localities were emptied completely of their population, both Muslim and Christian villages.
One of my questions is that who oversaw this ethnic cleansing, if you will, or the clearing out of the Palestinians? Was it just the Israelis, the Zionists running in and taking over, or was this overseen by the British, with the French, or the United States, or were there several occupying forces there, or was it just primarily?
During the First World War, both the British and the French sought the support of the Zionist movement, at the time thinking that the Zionist movement represents a large segment of Jewish voices, even though it really didn't, and there were many other Jewish voices who are anti-Zionist and who opposed the Zionist movement. But the British and the French thought that they could get some Jewish support for the World War I effort, and especially getting the US government to get into the war, by trying to support the Zionist movement. So that both the British and the French issued public statements. One was called the Jules Declaration by the French, and one was called the Balfour Declaration by the British, both in 1918, which said that basically in 1917, we support the Zionist aim of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And then, of course, when they won the Second World War and removed the Ottoman Empire, the British were in charge of that section of the Arab world, Palestine and Jordan and Iraq. And they proceeded to implement the Balfour Declaration by bringing in large segments of European Jews into Palestine to replace the Palestinians that exist there. And this is the essence of the problem, started with the British occupation of 1918 to 1920, when it started, and the British mandate on Palestine that was instituted despite the wishes of the current inhabitants of Palestine. By the way, both Christians, Muslims, and Jews in Palestine opposed the Zionist movement. The chief rabbi of Jerusalem, for example, was against the Zionist movement and the idea of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine.
I meant to ask you this because in I believe it was 1912 was when Zionism developed as an actual cause.
Well, 1897 was the first Zionist Congress. There were other Zionist conferences, including 1912 and others.
Perhaps what surprised me most in this was the terrorism of the Zionists. All right, the actual terrorism of the early Zionists, like Ben Gurion and Golda Meir and Rabin and all of these people, and Sharon. All right, all of these people were extreme terrorists. Okay, I mean to the point of murderous people, and the things that that are attributed to them, the mass murders, bombings of all of the Palestinians, and it just amazes me that they went on, that they escaped world criminal indictment. Okay, and just like what's happening now, you know, but. How did they?
The audience may not be familiar with the history a little bit. I mean, Zionism is a colonial movement. And any colonial movement, be it whites in South Africa, French in Algeria, or the white Europeans when they came to North America and encountered native people. Any kind of colonial movement must use violence, otherwise they would be resisted, obviously, from encroaching on native lands. And so Zionism was no exception in adopting violent methods from the beginning to try and subdue the natives and remove them from their land and acquire the best land that those people live in. And this violence, so when people talk about, for example, the terrorism in the Middle East now being Palestinian or Hezbollah or Hamas or whatever, people must understand that, for example, the first attack on civilians occurred not by Palestinians, but by the Zionist movement. The first bombings in the supermarket was by the Zionist movement. The first throwing of grenades on buses was by the Zionist movement in the 30s and the 40s. The first airplane hijacking was by the Zionist movement, 1955-56. So people need to understand that in most colonial situations like this, the natives actually learned some of the techniques of violence from the colonizers.
From the Zionists.
As happens in all these situations. I mean, here, Native Americans against the white European settlers.
Most of the terrorist attacks that we've seen actually have many of them have been linked to the Mossad and to the activities of the Israeli intelligence, which is phenomenal. I mean, a lot of information has come out in the last year on this, including stuff on 911 and other things where they're involved. But
I also want people to know that the terrorism was not just directed against the Palestinians, but even against Jewish people. A Zionist movement directed some terrorism against Jews. For example, in Iraq, in the 1950s, early 1950s, to try and scare Iraqi Jews into leaving for Palestine, they put bombs in front of synagogues, in front of Jewish community centers in Iraq. And they continue to do this, for example, the Lavon affair in Egypt, where they targeted American interests in Egypt to try and make it look like Arab nationalists have done this. These are what they call false flag operations that the Mossad and other Israeli operatives have done in the past.
This is, and it's continuous, even to the Indonesian, to Bali, and all of these others. I mean, there really has not been any links, definite links, to Al-Qaeda, or they're in many of these instances, and many of them have been linked to the Mossad, okay, and it is Israel. And in the most recent, even in the London bombings and so on, they found this. But I think as we progress in informing the people what the show is doing, the culpability of Israel and the Zionists has never really been exposed, and is becoming. And I think with this attack in Lebanon, what they did there suddenly tore the mask off the brutality of this regime, and of course our own, you know, Bush's regime. But
well, I must say, I mean, obviously there is also violence that comes from Arabs and Muslims. I mean, let's be clear about that. There is some false flag operations and so forth that happen, but we have to be also clear that the native people and people who are occupied and colonized occasionally engage in violent acts, and these are morally things that you and I should look at carefully.
No, I
mean, in South Africa, for example, they used to put rubber tires around people and burn them alive. These are horrific acts that we do not obviously support. But one has to remember that these violent acts are symptoms of the underlying, what I call in the medical field, the etiology of the disease. The etiology of the disease in this case is racism and colonization by Zionists, which is the same as in South Africa was called apartheid, where there was violence both black against white and white against black. But the violence, which was predominantly, of course, the government attacks on the black people, this was a symptom of the original problem, which is the apartheid, the racism, the ethnic cleansing of the black people. And the same here with the Zionism and with the British colonization, and now the American government in Iraq, for example, and the violence in Iraq and all of that stuff. It's a symptom of the occupation.
The continual encroachment, I wanted you to turn to the map here possibly, but the continual encroachment of the Palestinian lands by the Israelis, and they're not ever having established their own boundaries, permanent boundaries. Not the Palestinians, but the Israelis.
Right.
Leave this wide open to continual further encroachment of lands and occupation of lands.
People have to realize that Israel is the only country in the world today that doesn't say what its boundaries are. Israel has never set its boundaries, going back, from its foundation. It never set and said, this is going to be my land. They always left it open so that they continue to slowly expand. And it has been the Zionist program, by its definition, is an expansionist program. And it started, as I said, in 1920 with a very small area of land that they acquired using the help of the British. And they slowly expanded to occupy the remainder of Palestine. But some people say that's not the only thing that they have the idea to acquire. And some people say even that the Israeli flag having two blue lines in it indicates that their interests are the river Euphrates and the Nile. Basically, the areas between the Nile and the Euphrates is the land that the Zionist movement covets. And in fact, many sections of the Zionist movement put that down on writing, that that's what they covet, is the land going into Egypt and into Iraq, basically.
So, yeah, okay. So in Mazin's book,
don't move here.
We have a graph here, and maybe you can explain it to us.
So in 1920, this is the extent of the Zionist colonization in Palestine, 1920. And you can see over the years what had happened with the Zionist movement controlling more and more of Palestine, and the Palestinian areas, which are the white areas left, basically ghettos or Bantustans left for the Palestinians. These are in what's called the West Bank of Jordan, which is this kidney-shaped area here, and then the Gaza Strip, which is a desert strip near Egypt. And that is basically what is left for the Palestinians. And this is 2003, and obviously as time goes by, more and more Palestinian lands are taken over, and less space is left for them to even survive. And most of the Palestinians are made refugees or displaced people.
So right now, this segment here, this is what's left as of 2003, I believe.
Right.
This is what, and is it in the white area that is left for the Palestinians? Or
right.
The rest has all been taken over illegally by Israel.
Right. And so now today there are 9 million Palestinians in the world, and about 6 million of them are refugees or displaced people.
I know you advocate nonviolence, and you're extremely devoted to this, and of course you've had your career sidetracked from both Yale and from Duke because of your outspoken involvement in the Palestinian issues, and you're now a geneticist working in New Jersey. I believe you have a private laboratory there that you're working on, but you seem like such a very adjusted to accepting these setbacks, but and you're also extremely driven to see it through. You're very patient, And I would be, well, being new to it, I guess I would be more to the extreme of rage, you know, if it was happening to me. I mean, I am to the extreme of rage, and it's not happening to me. so I applaud your tremendous patience. But I wanted to ask you how you have view it and how you see your progress in this happening.
Well, on a personal level, of course, I am a very, very fortunate Palestinian because I have a job and I live in America and I have freedom to speak, like speaking to you now. Yeah. For most Palestinians, they can't even dream of the kind of success or freedoms that I have. So I feel very blessed. I just want you to imagine, put yourself in the position of a Palestinian who was kicked out of his home in 1948, ended up in a refugee camp, is living in this refugee camp for almost 6 decades now. And not only that, but Israel comes and occupies the West Bank and Gaza, where some of these refugee camps are. And imagine as a Palestinian in Rafah refugee camp, for example, with a large family, where you can't work, and now Israel comes and occupy even this area, and they make you homeless again because they demolished your homes in Rafah. They demolished hundreds of homes in the Rafah refugee camp simply because they wanted to create more quote-unquote buffer zone for their military. They demolished hundreds of homes. So imagine these people and what they go through. So I, you know, as a person, cannot even imagine, even as a Palestinian, what these folks have to endure with continuous, you know, some of them made homeless 3 or 4 times, not one time. So if Americans were subjected to this kind of brutal attack, how would they behave and how would they react? How would you, if somebody comes and takes over your home and says, this is now my home, this is now my land.
I read on my radio show that an article that stated that all of the people that were, all the Jews who were evacuated from the Gaza, from Gaza, were paid $375,000 for their homes. Okay.
Right, you're talking about few settlers, colonial settlers, Zionist settlers who came into Gaza, confiscated.
Was given into any of the Palestinians.
Right, confiscated Palestinian lands, lived illegally on Palestinian lands. And then they were compensated for when the government decided that the cost of keeping them is not worth it, and also in return for removing those settlers from the Gaza Strip, the few settlers from the Gaza Strip, they increased by 3 times as many settlers into the West Bank as the ones they removed from the Gaza Strip. That charade of withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, which is not really withdrawal, was simply removing a few settlers and enforcing the occupation, increasing the occupation in Gaza by surrounding Gaza, making it a sieged open-air prison, and then increasing the number of colonial settlers in the West Bank.
So it was ridiculous. But what bothered me so much was that $375,000 was paid for, not by the Israeli government, by the United States. Okay, and our constant gifts, loans that equal upwards of $15 to $18 billion a year to Israel, all right, is going toward this type of thing, toward the occupation and the constant push out and genocide of the Palestinians, and that is what infuriates me. And we're going to, in the last part of this series, we're going to be talking with Gale and yourself and Leila, and in the last part, and I'd like to discuss how you as a Palestinian are treated in this country, when they see you or people see you, or if you go through the airports or as you go through security, what that is like and what it is, and how you are reacting to it, and how you feel that people should be aware of what's going on, and that the loss of rights and the loss of human decency
Yeah.
that we're experiencing here in this country is simply carryover from what's happening daily in Palestine.
As I said earlier, any kind of colonial movement must try to vilify the natives and make them look like savages, like
right.
beasts. I mean, that's what happened with blacks in South Africa. That's what happened with Native Americans here. They were called savages and beasts, and basically that stereotyping, that profiling that happens for Native people is a constant characteristic of colonial movements. And the Zionist movement in the US is no exception. There's a lobby in the US, and it's present in some of the media, it's present in Congress, that tries to vilify all Arabs and Muslims. By doing this, it's the only way that this movement will obfuscate the real happenings on the ground, which is basically theft of land, natural resources, water, all the rich agricultural land in Palestine. That's the reality of why they have to do this. They have to do this to vilify people. So I understand where they are coming from, that they want to vilify now all Arabs and Muslims. And by doing this, I end up as somebody with an Arabic name. Even though I'm Christian, I'm not a Muslim, I'm profiled like
Sure,
all these other folks.
Sure.
And they put me in categories of separation, basically. And I think this profiling, of course, is not intended for security reasons in any sense, shape, or fashion, because we know, and even security experts say it doesn't work. So it is really intended, again, just to obfuscate the issues and remove the issue of the discussion, which is the colonization
and also
and removal
just
of
to
the
create fear, create more
and create
more
fear so that the people support the government in giving Israel. When you mentioned how much money we give Israel more than what we give to Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Central America combined.
Yep.
And this is amazing for a country that's 0.1% of the world population. So why do we do that? Because there's a very strong Israeli lobby in Washington and controlling a lot of what people like Joseph Lieberman and others who are pushing for that kind of support for Israel.
True. I agree, and I believe there's more to it than that even, but that's more for another show. But we thank everyone for joining us on this segment of our show. Please join us for the next. And thank you. And Mazin, I really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Have you on again.